In May 2020, the Centre for Risk Studies at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School published an assessment on what 5 years of the current COVID-19 pandemic will cost the world economy. Their GDP at risk scenario, which was based on rapid recovery from the crisis, stated that the global loss for the pandemic could, as a low-end estimate, be $3.3 trillion of 5-year GDP. On the other hand, their full depression scenario ballooned the figure to $82.4 trillion of lost GDP. According to a mid-range consensus of economists published in the COVID-19 and business risk presentation prepared in May 2020 by the University of Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies, the most probable GDP at risk calculation added up to $26.8 trillion or 5.3% of the global 5-year GDP. Whichever of the amounts described match reality in 4 to 5 year timescale, we are talking about mind-boggling amounts of money. For the purposes of this podcast, the question of how many trillions the pandemic will eventually cost the world economy is not as important as the fact that the central banks were and are in fact able to create the trillions, print enough currency to cover the unprecedented COVID costs without destroying the world economy in the process. This is encouraging because Global Commission on Adaptation, which is an organization specialized on climate adaptation and spearheaded by people like the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Kristalina Georgieva of the International Monetary Fund, has stated that the world would need to invest $1.8 trillion to mitigate and respond to the most inevitable consequences of climate change during the 2020s. There were many, all too many in fact, who said that the possibility of actually being able to find such amount of money for this purpose was and is bleak. Now, thanks to COVID-19, we now know that with the right amount of urgency at play, trillions can in fact be found. The existence of man-made climate change is a scientific fact. It's a fact that we have already witnessed clear consequences of the process and with a significant level of confidence can predict that things will eventually become worse. How much worse is somewhat open for discussion. Climate change will, both directly and indirectly, induce, among other things, unprecedented human misery. That much we do know. Responding to human suffering requires resources, of which one is funding. In addition to a host of other measurements, you can and should put a price tag to humanitarian emergencies. UN OCHA's financial tracking service does this routinely. In 2012, the price tag for humanitarian emergencies for that particular year was $9.2 billion. 2016, the price was $19.7 billion, and in 2020, the price tag for humanitarian emergencies was $38.8 billion. There's a pattern of growth here. For as long as we have had data on the annual consolidated cost of humanitarian emergencies, there has not been a single year when the total cost would have been covered by funding to 100%. On the contrary, Between 2012 and 2020, the world has collected a deck of annual deficits amounting to a total of $83.3 billion of human suffering not covered by funding. Years 2019 and 2020 are of special interest because they are sending us a weak signal of things to come. There was an exceptional hike in terms of the value of humanitarian emergencies from the year 2019 to 2020. This value increased by almost a third, from approximately $30 billion in 2019 to approximately $40 billion in 2020. The volume of the hike is much explained by COVID-19. However, whilst the needs shot up, funding available to deal with the needs went, in fact, down. The gap between funding and needs doubled from $11.7 billion in 2019 to $21.5 billion in 2020. A record of 55% of the total was unfunded in comparison with the amount for the previous year. In 2020, $700 million less was made available to cover the increasing humanitarian emergencies all across the globe. What was different in 2020 compared to 2019? The most significant difference were the billions used by the governments traditionally covering most, if not almost all, of the global humanitarian response to pay for the plethora of costs caused by COVID-19 domestically. And herein lies the weak signal I was talking about earlier. Climate change, with all its direct and indirect effects, will present all countries with new challenges. Governments which traditionally have been responsible for covering much of the global funding for humanitarian action will increasingly need to divert resources to pay for domestic preparedness caused by rising sea levels, increasing heat stress, storms, challenge to nature, and other phenomena linked to climate change. The worst-case scenario, therefore, is that sometimes, in the not-too-distant future, increase in humanitarian emergencies and human suffering may face the reality of dwindling funds available to deal with even the most critical of needs. Should this become reality, the end result could even be that the distressed global humanitarian emergency caused by the interaction between climate change and other developments falls out of control completely. Risk assessments. How probable or possible is it that increase in human suffering on one hand and lack of resources to deal with that on the other might actually clash to the extent of derailing the humanitarian response system? Should we, as I think we should, come to the conclusion that this is an exceptionally extreme but nevertheless possible scenario, we should take note of it and try and identify appropriate countermeasures. Encouraged by the fact that the corona emergency has been met with matchless amounts of scientific, private and public, human and financial resources, we should allocate the same remedy to prepare for the most critical, most probable future developments. As shown by available statistics, we as humankind have never been able to fully meet the needs caused by humanitarian emergencies. We have, however, so far been able to uphold a certain extent of control, and this is the minimum level which we need to be able to maintain. We should actually be able to do much more. One of the outcomes of the 2015 Paris Agreement was a pledge of governments to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 in new and additional funds to help developing countries avoid and adapt to the worst effects of climate change. This has not happened. It has been calculated that climate mitigation alone will cost developing countries $600 billion per year. The reality is that we need another gear altogether and a new scale to fathom the task ahead. The threats and solutions related to climate change must be translated into funding. Not only will climate funding need to be multiplied, it also needs to be targeted fairly. Climate funding must reach countries most at risk of the adverse effects and, within those countries, must efficiently reach the local level because there, at the local level, the paper trails of strategies, plans and Excel sheets will become reality and produce real, tangible results. The Red Cross-Red Crescent movement has a permanent presence in all four corners of the world. With its unique ability to scale up from local to global, responding correctly to the scale of different challenges and building, as a part of the communities it serves, sustained resilience, the Red Cross-Red Crescent movement is uniquely positioned as a key player in dealing with climate change and other forms of humanitarian hardships. What are the critical assumptions underlining the urgency of scrapping the humanitarian funding gap? Certain parts of the globe, especially at the equatorial region, are disproportionately affected by climate change. Many countries in these regions are among the least developed and, at the same time, some of the most populous. Many nations, especially in Africa, are among those projected to experience exceptional population growth. According to the most pessimistic 11 billion global inhabitants by the year 2100 version of the UN World Population Prospects data, as an ultimate example of this particular scenario, Nigeria could grow into a country of as many as 800 million inhabitants, 150 million more than the 650 million total for the whole of Europe. According to this UN scenario, 100 million of the 800 million Nigerians would live in the megametropolis of Lagos alone. Back in 2010, a total of 200 million people lived in the 10 largest megacities of the world. In the year 2100, the 10 largest cities of the world are predicted to be home to a total of 640 million people. From the 2010 list, cities like Tokyo, Mexico City, Beijing, Sao Paulo, New York and Shanghai have dropped off the top 10 list and have been replaced with Lagos, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Khartoum, Niamey and Kabul. These same equatorial regions and regions somewhat further up and down the latitudes are particularly dependent on agriculture and marine fisheries. These regions are negatively affected in terms of productivity in their food production. They will face the full force of the climate change, heat, stress, droughts, floods, and storms, and have the least working capital in terms of adaptation capacity. These regions furnish a platform for a veritable assembly run of global risks, climate change risks included. What needs to be done? The case for funding climate adaptation and preparedness is undeniable. Benefit-cost ratios from 1 to 2 to 1 to 10 even are undisputable. Whatever amount of billions is made available, investing in risk adaptation produces results with a multiplier when compared to funding response to realized risks. In order to avoid the possibility of a perfect humanitarian storm caused by the inability to address the overabundance of pressing issues, we need to live and feel the full urgency of the situation. Understand that unless we act and start acting now, COVID-19 may turn out to be a mere prelude of things to come. We need to scrap the gap. We need to do that before we ourselves fall into it.